Pericles is one of the late plays. So I think I mentioned briefly already in the Zoom session. The late plays include Pericles, Cymbeline, Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. So Pericles is the first of the four, usually dated around 1607, 1608. The Tempest is about 1612. Shakespeare wrote a couple of plays after The Tempest, co wrote them with John Fletcher, who became the in house playwright for The King's Men after Shakespeare retired. But basically, The Tempest was his last, mostly single authored effort, and so it's often described as his sort of last play, even though a couple others came after. So, of those four, there are a lot of similarities between them and a lot of differences to what he wrote before. And so there's been a lot of discussion from scholars in the last, couple hundred years about uh, how to sort of categorize these and think of them in terms of genre and things. So I just want to sort of very briefly cover some of that, particularly some of the stuff that I think is the most relevant to us and to thinking about Pericles, and also what we've talked about with genre in Shakespeare more generally. So all these late plays, they cover really long time periods, right? Most Shakespeare plays are basically imagined to cover, a couple days or a week or something. Usually not a terribly long time. All four of these plays, in some ways, cover a really long time. Now, Cymbeline and The Tempest both are much more sort of condensed. Um, the Tempest, especially, the entire play takes place in like 3 hours, but they still include references to stuff that happened like 12 or 14 years earlier. So that idea of there being this gap of time of like 12 or 14 years is very relevant in those two plays, and even more so in Pericles and The Winter's Tale, when that gap actually happens in the middle of the play. So in Pericles and The Winter's Tale, both we start off in the one, time period, and then somewhere around the middle of the play, we skip ahead 12, 14 years and pick up there. So in the case of Pericles, Gower, the chorus, takes us through that. With The Winter's Tale, there's an allegorical personification of time that comes on stage and takes us through that passage of a long period of time. So that's something that's very sort of consistent with these and unusual otherwise. They tend to end with reunion and reconciliation. Comedies usually have happy endings, so in some ways these are kind of comic endings, but they're often not with weddings that are about to happen. Sometimes they are. I mean, The Tempest definitely ends with some looking forward to a wedding ceremony, but for the most part, these last four have some kind of family reunion, but usually it's not a wedding that is, happening or about to happen, like is the case in most sort of regular comedies. Tragic comedy and romance are two of the most commonly ascribed genre descriptions by scholars now. Um, Romance existed as a genre in the period, but wasn't applied to drama. It was never applied to plays. And tragic comedy is it's actually one of the sort of hybrid genres that Polonius mentions, but it's not, technically considered a genre in the period. It comes sort of much later. Um, for my money, tragic comedy is a much better description for The Winter's Tale than it is necessarily for the other three. It could still be apt, for some of them, but I just don't think it's as relevant or helpful as romance is for most of these four plays. The Winter's Tale it works particularly well for because the the center of the play when time comes out, that clearly marks a shift from what had been tragedy to what will be comedy. So the idea of a tragic comedy being a combination of both tragedy and comedy works really well in that case. There's a very clear structural shift there. Usually it's not so clear. Most of the time, the term tragic comedy just applies to sort of a comedy that has tragic stakes, that has sort of life or death situations. But if we go with that kind of definition, then Measure for Measure and some other Shakespeare comedies would also fit it. I don't find tragic comedy as helpful of a genre description for us as I do romance. So why romance? What do I mean by that? How does can that apply to Pericles? So romance is one of these genres that has come to mean something very different than it used to be, right? So in the early modern period, tragedies end in death, comedies end in marriage. Comedies may have funny parts in them, but it's not a comedy because it's meant to be overly funny. It's a comedy because it ends in marriage. And in fact, lots of tragedies have very funny parts in them too, because they often liked mixing elements of levity and comedy into, any narratives anyways. Drama that we now think of as a genre for like serious stories, actually just applies to any play. Drama means plays, and so that's kind of different in how we've come to use it. But romance has changed quite a bit. It could mean a narrative that involved a love story, but not necessarily. If you think about what I'm calling here chivalric romance, and the very clearest example is Arthurian romances, any King Arthur story. Oftentimes there's elements of a love story in there. With King Arthur, there's Guinevere and stuff. But that's not the sort of necessary element for it to be a romance. It's a romance because it involves knights, chivalric knights. So, one of the reasons why this has meant something very different, Roman is actually Latin and other Romance languages, it just means book, or story. So, so a romance is a story. It's not necessarily a love story. Chivalric romance, Arthurian romance, involves knights going and doing things. And sometimes that might include, saving a damsel in distress or some other narrative that involves women and a love story, but oftentimes not necessarily. It might just involve like killing a monster or something, or saving a village or whatever, right? Um, so in these kinds of romances, there are knights errant, errant knights, and if you run errands, you go do miscellaneous things. Knights errant are knights that are sort of questing. They may be questing. There may be an ultimate goal, like finding the Holy Grail, but generally they're just like roaming around doing good deeds. So errant comes from the same root as error, and so it's to wander. And to error, to have an error is to go off track, to wander off the path. And so that's exactly what knights errant do, is they kind of wander around and get into various misadventures and things. So these tend to be very episodic, these kind of chivalric and Arthurian romances. And this is one way where Pericles, in particular, kind of resembles a TV show more than a film. I've said before that Shakespearean plays are pretty closely aligned to modern films in several ways. But this episodic nature is something we recognize much more often in TV shows, where, we'll have a certain cast of characters that just do different things in every episode. Something different happens, right? And so we end up with a shorter sort of story arc, that's part of this larger, narrative cohesion that we recognize as this particular cast of characters on the show. But each episode has different adventure going on. So chivalric romances are often very episodic. Part of this, knight errantry, running around doing different things, is that each of those things, in some ways, seems like a self contained plot that, may be part of their larger quest to seek the Holy Grail or something, but is often also, like I said, fairly self contained. Sometimes even interchangeable with other events in the larger story, or that the knight does. And so of course we see this in Pericles, like just all this random stuff happens to him. He's constantly traveling. He gets into multiple shipwrecks, and he just keeps getting into these different mini crises and stuff, and then gets out of it and moves on to the next thing, right? So there's a real episodic quality to Pericles, and in some ways that's pretty different from the other four. It's more episodic, I think, than the other late plays. Chivalric romance often has fantastic elements. There's often magic involved. If you think of Merlin with King Arthur, the Lady in the Lake, the Sword in the Stone, that kind of stuff. Well, in Shakespeare's late plays, we have lots of magic elements. Um, there's actually magic that gets used pretty much in all the plays except Cymbeline. The magic in The Winter's Tale is arguably fake, but Cymbeline, I can't off the top of my head recall magic in there. Although Jupiter, the Roman god, the Roman equivalent to Zeus, comes down on an eagle and and sort of comes to the rescue of one of the main characters. So there's magic in that way, but it's also specific to Roman gods. I say Roman gods here. Chivalric Arthurian romance was almost always Christian, and Shakespeare's late plays tend to be very sort of classical. There are lots of classical references, so it's always Roman gods. So we get Diana and Pericles. Jupiter descends on an eagle and Cymbeline. The Winter's Tale, maybe a little different here, and then the Tempest. There's a mask, a betrothal mask that involves some Roman gods as well. So Shakespeare takes this magic sort of fantasy element and uses some of the sort of classical allusions that we've seen a lot in all of his plays take this form. It's also, As You Like It, one of the earlier comedies, a kind of sister comedy to Twelfth Night, but one that we didn't read, also has a Roman god. Hymen, the god of marriage, appears at the end of that play. So in some ways, there are elements of these late plays that appeared before. It's just they're much more kind of consistently, congealed with these four plays at the end of his career. Stage directions, I say here, that's not necessarily for Arthurian romance or anything, but it is a really interesting connection for these four plays. They have some of the most elaborate stage directions in any Shakespeare play. And part of that may very well be because, with the possible exception of Pericles, these are all Blackfriars plays. They were written by Shakespeare to be performed in the Blackfriars Playhouse that the King's Men were able to start performing in 1608, 1609. So the special effects and things, the choice of instruments for music, all of that changes. And if you remember any of the pictures that I've included in earlier videos and presentations of the Blackfriars Playhouse, the interior, what it looks like, it's a much more sort of intimate setting than even the small stage of the Globe. But it seems as though Blackfriars plays and other plays written for indoor theaters tended to involve a lot of special effects. There seems to have been a lot of focus on spectacle in plays written for these theaters at this time. Now, I don't want to overstate the idea that these are Blackfriars plays. I think it matters, and I think it ties the plays together in another way. But scholars have sometimes gotten kind of carried away with that distinction and ignored the fact that the entire time the King's Men were performing at the Blackfriars, they were always still performing at the Globe too. So they could charge a lot more money at the Blackfriars. They had smaller audiences. It was probably closer to where they lived. There were all kinds of advantages to performing at the Blackfriars, and yet they remained at the Globe as well because it was indoors. They didn't have to worry about weather. But the whole time they're still performing at the Globe, and they're performing at court performances as well too. So whatever they did for these in some way had to be able to be done at other theaters. With stage directions, some of the clearest kind of outliers that appear in these late plays and are really unusual. The Tempest has more sort of very lengthy and specific stage directions than pretty much any other play, probably because the text that was used from it for the first folio included revisions for a court performance. At least that's what we think. All of these are folio only plays except Pericles, which is really bibliographically weird, but I'll have to address that elsewhere. In Pericles, probably the most elaborate stage directions we have are for the dumb shows. We've got several dumb shows in here, easily more than any other Shakespeare play. And the only other one that we've seen them in, one of the plays we've read, is Hamlet. There's a short dumb show there. But here we've got several dumb shows. Gower as the chorus is also a weird structural element that's really unusual for Shakespeare. But the dumb shows are certainly require very elaborate stage directions, right? Because they're sort of silent shows where just the action and gestures are supposed to represent clearly, what is meant to be conveyed. So those require really elaborate stage directions, anyways. And then the other two late plays, The Winter's Tale and Cymbeline, have some of the most famous stage directions of any Shakespeare play. The most famous being from The Winter's Tale, Exit Pursued by Bear, which is which is a really, seemingly mundane stage direction until you think about it, where there's supposed to be a bear chasing someone. And we have no idea how that was performed. Was it just somebody in a bear costume? And if so, how, realistic or not did it look? There's even been some scholars who have suggested that because some of the theaters were also used for bear baiting or were near bear baiting pits, it's possible that they had used a real bear, which is unlikely, at least in a public or private indoor theater, either one. But it has been argued that maybe for a court performance, that something in front of James, they would have brought in a bear for that, perhaps at least like a bear cub or something. So that's been argued, but there's really no good evidence for how that was performed. But there's a character that exits being pursued by a bear, so that's quite remarkable for The Winter's Tale. And then in Cymbeline, Jupiter descending on an eagle, as I've already mentioned, is my personal favorite sort of spectacular stage direction. They certainly had the pulleys and mechanics to make that happen. We have no idea how big the eagle would have been, but if that was what was actually performed and it was done at the Blackfriars, it must have been something to see. Somebody representing the most powerful of Roman gods descending on a giant eagle. It must have been really entertaining. So, we have these elaborate, unusual stage directions that we see in all of these plays that are also sort of Blackfriars plays. So it's very kind of interesting how spectacular they were, how much they relied on spectacle. And then travel in exotic locations are certainly part of chivalric romance, part of those, errands, those various adventures, sort of side quests and things that come up. And in all of the late plays, we see a lot of this too. The Tempest is a little bit different because the entire play takes place on an island, but even there, we get the backstory that tells us about the Duke of Milan, or what we would now call Milan, being banished and ending up on this island. The characters shipwrecked during the play were on their way back to Italy, returning from a wedding in North Africa. So the various locations there are mostly implied by dialogue and where people have come from and are returning to, even though the play takes place entirely on this sort of magical, almost uninhabited island. But the other three, there's all kinds of various locations traveling around, usually by ship and including shipwrecks. Cymbeline has a little bit of that because there is some travel from England to Rome and back. But for the most part, the traveling is around England there. But in the others, it's all traveling by sea and shipwrecks and things going on, which is why I mentioned shipwrecks here, because that's also very common for this travel in exotic locations and is maybe a little bit less common in some of the sort of Arthurian and chivalric romance, but is also an element there too. I don't think chivalric romances have quite as many pirates as some of Shakespeare's late plays tend to have. And then lastly, I've mentioned here foundling narratives. So, what's a foundling narrative? The best, most ready example is King Arthur, the sort of the sword in the stone story, where, King Arthur, I mean, I could give you the proper medieval version of it, but the version most people are familiar with, the kind of Disney movie version, basically just has, King Arthur being raised by a knight or, some other people in England who raise him as a regular boy to be a squire and a knight, not knowing that he is the heir to the throne, that he's actually supposed to become the King of England. And that ultimately that doesn't become apparent until he pulls this sword from the stone, revealing that he's actually the proper King of England, that that's his destiny. Originally, it's not just because it's some kind of magical destiny, but it's also because he actually was the heir, the prince of England, but was sort of given to somebody else to raise, and they apparently didn't know that he was royal, and he was brought up not knowing himself that he was royal until the whole sword in the stone bit, and eventually Merlin revealed to him his actual ancestry and everything. So the whole idea with a foundling narrative usually involves somebody with like royal or aristocratic blood who somehow doesn't know it, that they're raised elsewhere by peasants or, some family that doesn't realize who they really are. Or if they do realize it, they never reveal it to the child until they're older, and then their sort of inherent nobility or, sort of royal blood reveals itself somehow. Really, really common in chivalric romance, Arthurian literature, best known from King Arthur himself, from that sort of the stone story. And we see it in Pericles with Marina, who is, left with Cleon and Dionysa to be raised by them, which is very sort of bizarrely absent father Pericles, just, deciding he's too grief stricken to be able to raise a baby. And ends up leaving her there for for well over a decade. But it ends up becoming an element in really all of the late plays. The Winter's Tale has a baby who's left for dead when the bear is pursuing somebody who is leaving her for dead, assuming that she was going to die there too. She ends up being raised as a shepherd's daughter, not knowing that she's a princess until later on. In Cymbeline, there are two princes that were kidnapped by a general when they were infants and raised by him kind of in a cave. He's actually a good guy, but it's a bizarrely complicated story. Anyways, the three of them are kind of the three redneck cave dwelling sort of dwarf like figures in this very sort of folk tale-ish based play that has Snow White like figure dealing with the wicked stepmother who's the queen and joining three dwarves instead of seven, fleeing from a kind of troll or ogre like character who's just a big smelly oaf, and ultimately, being put to sleep by poison, but people think she's dead. So, there's a heavy folklore element there too, as well as the the other kind of traditionally chivalric romance elements. But there again, you get the sort of foundling narrative that these princes, don't become themselves, aren't revealed to be, of royal blood and are supposed to inherit the kingdom until the end of the play. And then in The Tempest, we find out really at the beginning of the play that the daughter of the Duke of Milan, who is banished and ended up on this island with a young daughter, she finally finds out that she is indeed the daughter of a duke, and she had never known that. She just he had never bothered telling her why they ended up there or what had happened, and so he tells her at the beginning of the play. So in all four, you get this foundling narrative that's very conventional in chivalric romance and Arthurian romance, but is really unusual from other Shakespeare plays, Shakespeare narratives. So you can kind of see how these late plays are really easily categorized together. They seem to have these similarities or these patterns that appear in most of them. A lot of things can really, group together at least three of the four, if not all four. As I've mentioned, there, one or two don't have some of the traits that the other three have or something like that. But generally, they all four have a lot of very strong similarities. And so it's a really kind of unusual genre if we think about this being the end of Shakespeare's career, the kind of long career he's had of doing comedies and history plays early in his career with a little bit of tragedy, a lot more tragedy and comedy. He had a series of Roman plays that were mostly tragedies that were kind of right after Measure for Measure and right before this late period. But now in this late period, he's got all these kind of romances, late romances, very spectacular and unusual. And they're also kind of recycle some elements from earlier plays in weird and interesting ways too. The kind of Othello narrative of a husband who's been convinced that his wife has cheated on him, and so he plots to murder her. That comes up in both The Winter's Tale and Cymbeline. And it plays out differently in both, but it's very sort of clearly there. It's kind of a very clear reminder of Othello, that then, Shakespeare takes in ultimately a different direction. But there's elements from Twelfth Night and As You Like It as well that we see popping up again, a little bit from Hamlet. We get some more ghosts in Cymbeline, and like I said, we get these Roman gods and things too. So that's what's going on with the late plays in general, and I think you can kind of see how Pericles fits into that. I mean, ultimately, it was the first of the four, and so it's not clear if Shakespeare had this plan in mind to shift this kind of genre, or what exactly he might have been thinking when he was writing Pericles itself. It does seem very experimental in a lot of ways. The use of Gower as the chorus, the only other play he uses a chorus is in Henry V, which was right around Hamlet, right around 1599, 1600. So to bring back a chorus, to have it be Gower, who's this medieval poet, is very kind of unusual and experimental. And then all of these dumb shows too. It's quite strange, and those are elements that don't pop up in the other late plays.